In August 1945, the US dropped their first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. As you may know, the plane that carried the bomb was named Enola Gay after the pilot's mother. What you might not know is that there were two other planes, another bomber, lame, and an at the time unnamed photography aircraft that carried researchers that were supposed to take pictures of the explosion and the general effects of the bomb. And that plane was later dubbed Necessary Evil. The bomb was initially aimed at Aoi Bridge in the center of Hiroshima, but due to crosswinds it missed and instead detonated directly over Shima Surgical Clinic, killing all patients and staff instantly. Ironically, the only surviving members of the staff were Dr. Shima himself and his attending nurse because they were in another town helping with an operation at the time. The clinic was rebuilt 3 years later and is today run by Dr. Shima's grandson. The bomb itself was considered very ineffective as only 1.7% of its uranium actually fissioned. Nevertheless, it is estimated that about half of the population of Hiroshima died by the end of the year from the effects of the bomb. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, and 6 days after that, the Japanese surrendered. 8 years later, in 1953, then US President Dwight D. Eisenhower gave a speech titled Atoms for Peace. After the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, people around the world were afraid of nuclear warfare. These fears were fueled by the nuclear tests by Russia and the UK. China and France would follow in the 60s. The Cold War also didn't help. With his speech, Eisenhower wanted to alleviate these fears and also show that nuclear technology could be used for good instead of just war and destruction. Atoms for Peace wasn't just a speech, it was a whole government program that was of course used for propaganda during the Cold War, but also has some real positive long-lasting effects that we can feel even today. Before Atoms for Peace, everything nuclear was a matter of national security, as nuclear technology was only used for warfare. Through the program, peaceful scientific research was made possible, and it allowed standards and regulations to be established. The speech was harshly criticized by the Russians because Eisenhower was talking about peaceful applications and even disarmament, so getting rid of their nuclear weapons, but all the while the US was still researching, testing and stockpiling nuclear weapons. And even today the US has more nuclear weapons than it had before the Atoms for Peace program. To improve their international relations and really show that the US wanted to be a force for peace instead of destruction, they entered into a bunch of so-called research bilaterals in which they provided other countries with uranium and also information on how to build research reactors. In exchange, the US would be allowed to inspect these research reactors and all the spent fuel had to be returned to the US, but through this, together with the established standards and regulations, it made it possible for the US to prevent other countries from acquiring nuclear weapons. The first bilateral was with Turkey, a strategic partner close to the Soviet Union, and in 1961, 38 research bilaterals had been signed with countries all over the world, including Japan and Germany. This was of course also an effort to bind these countries to the US and prevent them from acquiring nuclear weapons themselves. From today's perspective, some of the more interesting partners that didn't quite work out are China, who was already communist at the time, Iran, where the US recently bombed their nuclear facilities, Cuba, that later allied with Russia and almost triggered World War III, Israel, which is thought to have nuclear weapons but it isn't officially confirmed, and of course Vietnam, where the US later went to war. The reactors and information could be supplied by private American companies, for example by AMF, which is better known for their bowling equipment, but they also made nuclear reactors. One of, if not the most important part of the Atoms for Peace program is the Non-Proliferation Treaty, a treaty that most countries on Earth have signed as of today. Notable exceptions are India, Pakistan, Israel and North Korea. North Korea was actually part of the treaty, but exited in 2003 when they did their first nuclear tests. The NPT states that countries that already have nuclear weapons can keep them but should work towards disarmament, and at the same time they should provide information for peaceful applications of nuclear technology to all the other countries, while also not helping those countries acquire nuclear weapons. Countries that don't have nuclear weapons yet agree to never acquire them and in exchange get all the information for peaceful applications of nuclear technology. The countries that already had nuclear weapons at the time are the US of course, Russia, China, the UK and France. The treaty was first negotiated in the 60s and then took effect in 1970. The duration was at first set for only 25 years, and after those 25 years, in 1995, the parties all came together again and agreed to extend it indefinitely. An interesting thing is that the US, under their research bilaterals, supplied other countries with uranium for their research reactors. This uranium that they supplied was weapons-grade highly enriched uranium, And that of course would under the NPT now count as proliferation, so would be forbidden. Nowadays research reactors are supposed to use low enriched uranium, but many countries still have highly enriched uranium and continue to use it in their research reactors. An actual kind of fun part of the Atoms for Peace program were the so-called Gammators. Gammators were distributed to schools around the US to teach children about the possibilities of nuclear technology. They weighed 840 kilograms and contained 400 curies of cesium. Cesium is deadly at a dose of about 245 micrograms per kilogram of body weight, and 400 curies come out to around 4 grams. Up to 140 Gammators were distributed throughout the US. And I say up to because nobody knows how many there actually were, and the government didn't get all of them back. Cesium has a half-life of around 30 years, so by now it's decayed quite a bit. There's less than 200 curies left, but I still think the government should keep track of where they sent that deadly radioactive material. A scientist thought it would be a cool idea to shoot plants with gamma rays and just kind of see what happens. And then what happened, of course, is that the plants mutated. In nature, plants mutate all the time. We then take the plants that work best for us, maybe they just taste the best, or they have the highest yield, or they grow the best in our soil, and we plant the seeds of those plants and then call that selective breeding. Radiation, of course, also triggers mutations. And the idea is that we can use this to find mutations that work best for us a lot quicker. To do this, we use gamma gardens. Usually they're circular and have their radiation source at the center, which is usually cobalt-60. They of course have heavy shielding around the field so nothing else gets radiated, and they can get pretty big. In Japan, for example, there's a 200-meter wide field with an 8-meter high dike around it. The resulting plants show no traces of the radiation or any human intervention. So they're not genetically modified crop, they're just like naturally occurring mutations. There were also clubs where hobby gardeners could get these seeds and plant them in their own gardens and then report back the results. But because the results often weren't very spectacular, these clubs quickly fell out of favor. Gamma gardens are still used today though, mostly to find mutations that are resistant to specific fungi or viruses. But if you've ever eaten a grapefruit from Texas, that was probably a mutation discovered through radiation breeding. There's also some other stuff. There's a Atoms for Peace Galaxy. Neat, I guess. There's an Atoms for Peace, or there was an Atoms for Peace award. First one went to Niels Bohr, and the last one went to Eisenhower himself in 1969. There's also nuclear-powered ships, but most of them are military, so atoms yes, peace no. So that's the end of the video. I hope you learned something. Tell me in the comments if you didn't. Leave a like, subscribe. Okay, bye!